We are here with you today to analyze the film The Fountain, directed by Aronofsky. The analysis you are about to see is intertwined with the principle of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, and our work will be based on theory of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the process of individuation. This analysis will proceed using the method of dream interpretation in Jungian psychology. This is because the film's narrative language, rather than being linear or plot-driven, bears a complete resemblance to the structure of a dream, like sudden shifts, simultaneous spaces, mirroring of scenes, and the combination of personal and mythical narrative. To clarify our past, we must distinguish between two types of experience. First, if we look at the superficial story, we see Tom, the physician, dealing with his wife's grief and illness, unable to come to terms with the issue of death. Fearing loss, he misses the present moment. Second, however, if we look at the inner psychological experience, then this narrative will not be superficial. The film does not merely address the acceptance of death or the value of the present moment. Rather, the issue is much deeper. This as a psychological process, as a gateway to rebirth and change in the level of consciousness. Therefore, we'll begin this interpretation with three clear steps. A brief overview of Darren Aronofsky filmography and Jung's theoretical foundation, particularly concerning Anima and Animus. Presentation of a symbolic list of key film elements without interpretation, purely as a tool for analysis in the next stage. A rereading of the film's dreamlike narrative structure, where storylines, instead of being separate, are interpreted as layers of a shared psychological experience. Along this path, each part of the film will be seen as representing a station in the individual's psychological journey toward transformation, from denial of death to surrender to meaning, from the failure of love to unity in the collective unconscious. Framework for understanding symbol, religion, and myth in Jungian psychology. Before delving into the analysis of symbols, religious concepts, and psychological archetypes, it is essential to highlight a fundamental point. In Jungian analytical psychology, the language of the unconscious is metaphorical, symbolic, and mythical. In other words, when we speak of concepts like masculinity, femininity, the tree of life, or even God, their meaning is not necessarily the same as common objective, historical, or social definitions. Rather, these words are names for ancient inner human structures, psychological forces that have formed at pre-verbal, pre-cultural, and experiential spiritual levels. The symbolic unconscious, not logical. In this space, the human mind is divided in two levels: conscious, analytical, linguistic, logical mind; unconscious, imaginative, symbol-making, emotional mind. In Jungian psychology, when we speak of anima, animus, father, mother, or son, we are essentially using the language of the second level, that is the unconscious. Therefore, this concept should not be understood as descriptive or expressive of real people or biological genders. For example, femininity here does not refer to a gender, but to an intuitive, nurturing psychological force connected to the unconscious within every human being, male or female. Theoretical example: myth and the unconscious. Dreams and dreams are individual myths. For instance, when an individual encounters a rising sun in a dream, that sun might symbolize the self, the complete self, or a symbol of consciousness, or even death and rebirth, not merely the physical sun in the sky. From Jung's perspective, religion, ritual, and myth are historical and cultural reflection of these very archetypes. What has been recorded in the history of religion, be it in Christianity, Zoroastrian, Islam, Mayan, and Egyptian myth, are all external forms of experience that have a universal psychological root. Therefore, a psychological analysis of religion does not mean judging the truth or invalidity of any particular religion, but rather it is a scientific attempt to understand the psychological and experiential function of these symbols in humanity's inner journey. phenomenological analytical approach. This approach also aligns with phenomenological and hermeneutic traditions. For example, Mircea Eliade or Paul Ricoeur also consider religion and myth not as scientific data, but as meaning-making structure of human experience, structures that must be understood from within the world of human experience, not from outside of it. Practical conclusion. So, in this analysis, when we say the sun symbolizes the self or Anima is Easy in the movie, we do not mean that Tommy or Easy represent specific historical figures, but rather we want to say that the human psyche in its inner experience make them meaningful in this way. A brief review of Darren Aronofsky filmography. Darren Aronofsky, an American filmmaker born on February 12, 1969 in Brooklyn, New York, graduated from Harvard University with a degree in filmmaking and is one of the most significant figures in contemporary psychological and surrealist cinema. Aronofsky's style is a synthesis of psychology, myth, and anxiety-inducing visual form. He often explores characters engaged in deep struggle with death, addiction, obsession, or meaning of existence. Surreal imagery, nervous editing, and heavy soundtracks are recurring tools in all his works. Now, among his works, several movies are directly linked to the inner world of the founder. Story of obsession mathematician searching for absolute order in universe. The themes are paranoia, isolation, and intertwining of knowledge and madness. Requiem for a Dream 2000. A bleak narrative of psychological collapse of four characters entangled in addiction. Focus on the experience of fragmented reality. Black Swan 2010. The story of a ballerina who loses her way on border between reality and illusion. The themes are Anima, Animus, shadow, and the psychic duality. Mother 2017. A symbolic, intensely mythical story about creation, destruction, and the cycle of life. Perhaps the closest film in terms of dreamlike structure and spiritual form to the fountain. Existence in suspicion overall. Darren Aronofsky is a filmmaker who walks the line between reason and madness, death and immortality. His films immerse the viewer in a deep, unstable, and sometimes disturbing experience of human unconscious. And perhaps The Fountain is the culmination of his effort to dialogue with concepts like death, love, and the cosmic cycle of life. Theoretical foundation of Jung's theory. Understanding the phenomenon of transference is not only one of the fundamental pillars of psychotherapy, but at a deeper level plays a central role in the process of psychological transformation as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious. In this sense, transference transcends a mere clinical framework, appears a symbolic and even a spiritual phenomenon, a process in which the human psyche attempts to rediscover and recognize its inner archetypes in another through projection and representation. In traditional psychoanalysis, transference occurs when an individual projects their past feelings and relational patterns, usually rooted in their relationship with parents, onto the therapist, but from Jung's perspective, this process belongs to a broader realm. In transference, collective archetypes such as Anima and Animus emerge from the unconscious and are reflected personally in current relationships. This is where transference becomes the symbolic language of the psyche for dialoguing with itself. A language that encompasses both existential philosophy and mysticism. Based on this, understanding archetypal structure like Anima and Animus becomes a fundamental necessity, serving as an analysis of the deeper layer of transference. Jung shows how this inner opposite influence human relationship and experience of the self through transference. Here, the work of transference is to reveal fundamental contradictions such as female-male spirit, matter, conscious and unconscious, and the ultimate goal is not to eliminate these contradictions, but to reconcile and integrate them on the path of individuation. In Jungian analytical psychology, anima and animus are fundamental archetypes form of human psyche, representing the feminine aspect in men and masculine aspect in women. These two forces unconsciously permeate the human personality and influence how an individual relate to the opposite sex, the world, and their true self. The anima in men usually forms based on his experience with his mother and appears in dreams and projected as figures like a goddess, lover, daughter, or mother. A man who remains caught in the grip of the anima tends to reside in a world of fantasy and childlike dependence, becoming helpless when confronted with reality. In contrast, the animus in women arises from her experience with her father and often manifests as definitive judgment, rigid opinion, and tendency towards self-centered argumentation. A woman afflicted by animus, despite appearing inanimate, may possess an arrogant inner state possessed by ideas that prevent genuine dialogue or the acceptance of differences. In this state, instead of living in reality and a lively relationship, the woman dwells in a world of dogmatic preconceptions and intellectual illusions. When anima and animus appear in human relationship, their interaction becomes filled with excitement, misunderstanding, and conflict. A relationship that might appear passionate and vibrant from the outside carries within it a kind of unconscious battle that reflects the individual's psychological projections. However, these same unconscious forces, if correctly recognized and consciously integrated, can become a source of inner growth, inspiration, and meaning for an individual's life. Jung believed that anima and animus are gateways to accessing the collective unconscious and deciphering humanity's inner myth. By understanding them, an individual enters a profound stage of individuation process, a journey that begins with recognizing the shadow and ultimately leads to the unification of inner opposites. However, such a journey is not easy, as one must transcend illusion, projection, and distorted images about oneself and others to achieve a deeper reality of the self. Myth as the language of the cosmos, the interconnection of symbols, psyche, and the physics. In this section, we use scientific data as metaphors and illustrative examples, not as scientific facts. The approach of Carl Jung and Wolfgang Pauli in the book The Innermost Kernel draw an interdisciplinary perspective between analytical psychology and quantum physics. This viewpoint attempts to show how common patterns can be discovered between the unconscious structure of the human mind and the fundamental structure of the physical reality. Within this framework, myth is considered not merely an ancient narrative, but a symbolic language for speaking about the cosmos and the psyche, a language that strives to regain the lost unity between matter and meaning. In this context, myth such as Q-Mars in the Iranian tradition or the Platonic hermaphrodite in the Greek tradition carry concepts that can be seen as symbolic manifestation of primordial unity. This concept is introduced by Jung and Pauli as endus mundus, a single world in which psyche and matter are two sides of a unified reality. This reading of myth is an attempt to approach deeper layer of meaning, not through scientific formula, but through cognitive metaphor and symbolic reflections. For instance, in the myth of Q-Mars, the word duhshak, traditionally interpreted as a characteristic or quality, has been linked in some linguistic studies, such as those by Bartholme, to a root related to the word jinn. In this interpretation, duhshak cannot only be a factor in the survival of lineage, but it can also be conceived as a cosmic warmth field, a hidden space that implicitly holds existential potential in a pretemporal and latent form. This image brings us closer to a concept in quantum physics, the quantum vacuum, an empty space that nonetheless has the capacity for genesis. In other words, just as in empty quantum quantum fields, matter has not yet emerged, but its potential is present in QMARS 2. Life in a biological sense has not yet begun, but its seed is present in the symbolic structure of Dukshak. This type of interpretation of myth should not be confused with scientific claims. What this metaphor offers are in fact cognitive tools that help us reread ancient symbols with the language of contemporary science, without forgetting the fundamental difference between metaphor and objective reality. Such a rereading shows how myth, even in its earliest layers, can approach the fundamental structure of reality, not with the language of experiment and measurement, but with language of meaning, psyche, and mystery. In mythical tradition, the idea of psychic unity has been depicted as hermaphroditic beings. For example, in Plato's Symposium, primordial humans are described as complete, spherical beings with 2 faces, 4 arms, and 4 legs. The gods, fearing the power of this being, divided them into 2 halves, and since then, humans have always been searching for their lost half. Jung sees this narrative as a metaphor for the psyche's attempts to achieve inner totality. In the Iranian myth of QMARS, we also encounter such a duality. QMARS is not only the first human, but in some narratives, a hermaphroditic being who simultaneously embodies both life and death. His name is composed of 2 parts. Gaio means life and Mart means death. And this duality symbolizes the coherence of opposite at the fundamental level. From this perspective, QMARS is a manifestation of a kind of liminal state, existence in suspicion, somewhere between being and not being. This state can be compared to the condition of quantum field, where no particle has yet been created, but the possibility of genesis flow within the space. From Jungian psychological perspective, this symbolic suspension can also be linked to Anima and Animus duality. Death in many psychological structures is linked to the face of the Animus, a masculine element that not only represents power and intellect, but is also a symbol of limitation, stasis, and separation. Unlike the anima, which signifies validity, dynamism, and connection with existence, the immature animus often tends towards dominance and control and resists death. Even though it carries the very force that death represents. Even in the Persian language, the word mard means man, with root tracking back to the death and ending carries this same semantic connection. Consequently, QMARS can be considered a symbolic being who embodies not only the duality of life and death, but also the fundamental state of the possibility of being. In this creature, existence has not yet separated from the non-existence, and this ontological suspension leads us to the deeper understanding of the place of myth in the structure of the human mind and cosmic reality. Myth, in this sense, is not an ancient and forgotten narrative, but a living tool for contemplating the complex nature of existence. A tool can establish a metaphorical bridge between the language of the psyche and the language of the physics.